Welcome to World Social Studies for Elementary Teachers. This is Lecture C4, System Development. In this lecture, we look at the development of new world orders. This lecture continues our examination of key transition points in the Westphalian system and the development of the modern system that we have today. After listening to this lecture, you should be able to accomplish all of the objectives listed on this slide. When the Cold War ended, President Bush Sr. at the time gave a speech, and he was announcing the end of the Cold War, and he said something to the effect that he wasn't going to dance on the Berlin Wall, that the United States was going to be prudent in its use of its newfound preeminent position in the global order, and that he foresaw that with the end of the Cold War, a new period of peace that was coming upon us. And he used the term New World Order to refer to this new epoch that the world was entering with the United States at the helm. Conspiracy theorists immediately seized on that phrase of the New World Order as proof of their belief of a shadow government about to spring out from behind the curtain and destroy the Constitution. That's not quite what President Bush had in mind, though. When he was talking about a new world order, he was referring to a phrase that is used to describe any time there is a major shift in world power distribution. That shift in the power distribution is usually accompanied by an evolution of the Westphalian order. So just as the Westphalian system had its birth at the end of the 30 Years' War, at the end of every major war in the system, there's been an effort to revise the system, for the winners would rewrite the rules of the game in an effort to avoid having to fight another major systemic struggle. And so with the new rules and the new pattern of interactions that was set up, the world entered a new world order. And so there have been multiple times in the Westphalian history where the system has shifted over time. In the previous lectures in this series, we've talked about the origin of the Westphalian system, with the fall of Rome and the end of the imperial system which predated it, and then the rise from the anarchic Dark Ages to a proto-state system in the Renaissance period, followed by the internecine struggles of the Reformation, ending in 1648 with the establishment of the Westphalian system. After Westphalia was established, the next major power struggle that threatened the Westphalian system was the French bid to dominate Europe. Westphalia was drawn up by the Dutch, and the British were their primary allies, and the British continued to grow strong. After 100 or so years, the French grew in great power. Now, if we look at shifts in global trade, the Atlantic trade was increasingly important now, and the Dutch had ceased to be the major seafaring power, and the British and French competed with each other to dominate that Atlantic trade. They fought a series of wars as part of their rivalry for which of those two would rise to preeminence. The French bid for dominance was ultimately defeated, and we have the picture here of the Battle of Waterloo, which was the final end to the French effort to dominate Europe. At the end of the Battle of Waterloo, England was established as the dominant power in Europe and in the Atlantic. France was defeated by an alliance of many countries, but that alliance was led by England. And so at the end of this great struggle, the victors again looked at the world and said, how can we not do this again? How can we rewrite the rules to prevent another great power war that would threaten the Westphalian order? The solution that the British proposed was what we now call the Concert of Europe. It was essentially a system where the monarchs of Europe would get together and talk about their differences to try to resolve problems before they escalated to the point that it would cause war between the major powers. With the defeat of the French, the British and their allies reinstated the monarchies throughout Europe. And so whenever there was a crisis over a colonial holding, for example, there would be a conference called. And so England did not dominate Europe as a power that was the dominant power. Instead, they had a hands-off approach. The idea of the concert is the British may play violins, but it's okay if other countries want to have a bass section or a percussion section. They can do their own thing. The English don't feel the need to conquer and subsume those powers into their violin section. So the English go ahead and play their violin. The other powers over here go ahead and play their brass section. The other players over here play their percussion section. And together they create a harmonious concert. And so that's what the design of the concert system was to bring interests that might cause conflict that in the past encouraged and emboldened a state to try to conquer their neighbors. Instead, they would negotiate and try to find a harmonious outcome to those conflicts. An example of this in action was the 1850 Conference of Berlin. The Berlin Conference was the European powers had rediscovered the continent of Africa and the tremendous riches that were there. And they knew that the potential for conflict in the land grab that was 1800s European imperialism could put these interests, these countries, these imperial powers at odds as they bumped into each other in this new grab for colonies and empire. And so they held a concert, they held a meeting. The way the Concert of Europe worked was one prince would want to hold a conference, and they would then send gilded invitations out to their fellow monarchs, who would send a gilded RSVP back. And a month or two later, they would all meet at somebody's palace. They would then sit in the room and talk about the differences that they had. So that's what they did with Africa. They all got together and they met in Berlin, and they got out the 1850s version of what they thought Africa looked like and grabbed their 1850s version of a permanent magic marker, and they just drew the lines. And they said, Germany, you can have this part. England, we're taking this part. France, you can have that part. The Belgians, you'll have this part. The Portuguese, you'll have this part. And they just carved up Africa. In so doing, they made it so that it was not necessary for them to fight wars over who got what in the carving out of Africa. Instead, it was a negotiated solution. And so this is an example of how the concert operated. It worked quite well for the great powers of Europe because it prevented another continent-wide great power war. Now, it didn't work for everybody. It didn't prevent war completely. The great powers would still beat up on little powers, and little powers would fight each other, and nobody invited any Africans to come to that conference. But for the European great powers, it fulfilled the purpose for which it was designed, which was to prevent another war among the great powers in Europe. After 100 years, though, the concert system broke down with the outbreak of World War I. Now, there's a couple of reasons why this happened. The main reason is the advance in technology and the secret alliances that were going on. With the secret alliances, nobody was really sure where the balance of power existed. People thought countries were on their side who weren't. They also assumed countries would be an enemy who may not have been. And so it was difficult to gauge the balance of power. But the other problem is that Bismarck had demonstrated in the late 1800s the power of modern technology in advancing warfare. And through a series of 4 very short, very bloodless, inexpensive wars, Bismarck had unified Germany. And what everyone took from that was that the side that won the war was the side that mobilized the fastest, using modern train schedules and industrialization, all those things. And so once the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated and the alliance system started kicking in, then everybody felt rushed to mobilize immediately, because the French had learned the hard way that if you wait to do a standard mobilization, the Germans will be on your doorstep before you even put uniforms on your soldiers. So everybody immediately started mobilizing so they would not be taken by surprise. And as they mobilized, it led to armies being thrown against one another, and you have the onset of World War I. So the concert system broke down because it was too leisurely. World War I happened very rapidly, and there wasn't time to send out the gilded invitations and have all the monarchs get together and talk about it. The other thing that destroyed the concert was towards the end of World War I, the Russian Revolution. Russia was a great power in Europe, and the Russians killed their monarchs, and they had no interest in participating in what they saw as an illegitimate system of monarchs and capitalists that were acting for their own interests and not those of the people. And so the Russians weren't interested in playing that game. So the concert system broke down, and the result was the First World War. Now, with the First World War, this war exhausted the European powers. It was an industrial war that Europe had not seen before. The Americans had sort of invented industrial warfare in the Civil War, but the Europeans fought each other on a scale that had never before been seen. There was massive mobilization, conscript armies, industrialized armaments, and mechanized movement of troops. And the result was a war machine that just chewed up the people who were in it. And it was expensive in both blood and treasure. And the great European powers exhausted themselves in this stalemate struggle. And one result of this was a decline of the multipolar system. For the multipolar system, where there are several great powers acting in concert with one another, that was no longer true by the end of World War I. Instead, you had several mid-range to weak powers and a few other powers, namely the United States and Russia, who were rising in their relative power system. So the Westphalian system fundamentally alters after World War I. But it took a generation for people to realize that. The European powers tried to act like they were still the dominant powers in the system. The League of Nations, for example, is an example of how the Europeans tried to maintain their lead of the world. But the League failed, and one reason it failed was it left out the real key world players at the time. United States, Russia, Germany, later on Japan left. During the interwar period, another systemic shock occurred in the form of the Great Depression. And this Great Depression heightened competition between states. The Depression was combined with tariffs, and the tariffs were quite high compared to modern standards. And so that meant it really mattered who controlled what. If you wanted to sell a good in a foreign land, your good was not competitive because the tariff was so high. And so if you're, say, Germany, and you want to sell goods abroad, you're essentially shut out of the market because the the British and French have already grabbed all of the territory that you might sell to back in the 1800s. And so the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese became revisionist powers, meaning the system didn't work for them. And so they sought to change the system, to alter the system. So this heightened economic and political competition then leads to World War II, where Europe again racks itself with large-scale industrial warfare with massive conscription, and the concept of total war was put across here in World War II, where it wasn't just armies fighting one another, it was entire civilizations striking at the heart of each other and trying to eliminate the other side. At the end of World War II, then, we have another shift in the system. And this shift brings about another new world order, as the winners of the last great power war again seek to make sure that war doesn't happen again. That was done through a series of international institutions and reforms and ways of operating. But the point is that the Westphalian system shifts, and you have an evolution in the system after World War II, from the multipolar system of the concert of Europe to a bipolar system now in the post-war world. This bipolar system was marked by what we now call the Cold War, which is intense competition between the two dominant powers that emerged victorious from the Second World War, with the United States and its allies leading the West, and the Soviet Union and its allies leading the East. And this bipolar system of antagonism created a new system dynamic that the pattern of interactions altered in the Westphalian system, to where countries determined their foreign policies based upon what their allies were doing and what the other camp was doing. Part of this new world order was to create a new set of institutions. And the intent behind these institutions was to again create a situation where the winners of the war would not have to go back and do this again. How do you prevent another great power war in Europe? This time it would be World War III. Well, they set up these institutions. One is the United Nations, as an improvement in the League of Nations, because it included all actors. Also, it had a Security Council, so that it had the capacity to address crises that might occur. We have the creation of the World Bank. This is because of the recognition that the economic collapse in the Weimar Republic in Germany was largely responsible for the rise of the fascist powers. At least that's what was the perception at the time. So the World Bank was formed to help European countries rebuild their societies after World War II. And then the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, was designed to stabilize currencies, again to avoid the hyperinflation that had swept Europe and made it susceptible to fascism. So here we have another new world order that is creating institutions and patterns of interaction to prevent the outbreak of war again. This bipolar system lasted approximately 50 years, until the end of the Cold War. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which happened peacefully, much to all observers' surprise, we shifted from a bipolar system to a unipolar system. There's now only one dominant power in the global system, and that's the United States. So the end of the Cold War then promised another opportunity for a new world order, where the winners again sought to make sure that war wouldn't happen again. And this is what Bush was referring to in his speech, that he was planning on using the institutions that were created at the end of the Second World War now that the Cold War was over, those institutions could be used more vigorously and could fulfill the potential of their architects, and that would usher the world into a new era of peace that did not have great power war behind it. That's what the New World Order was. The United States remained dominant in this new order. Historians still don't have a good name for this period of time. At the time they called it the post-Cold War world, and that's probably what will stick. Nothing better than that seemed to present itself. But in this post-Cold War world, you had a vigorous United States that used its position of power and influence to spread its ideals abroad. We had a United Nations that was quite moldable to U.S. interests. So when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the United States was able to go to the United Nations and receive a mandate to push Hussein back out of Kuwait. And this is a slide of the ticker tape parade that the troops received when they returned home victorious from the Gulf War in 1992. And so this moment of U.S. hegemony, of U.S. dominance, was seen as a temporary thing, because a lot of scholars of international relations said that unipolarity was an anomaly, that history did not demonstrate that one power could dominate the entire system for any length of time. They argued that it was inevitable that other great powers would chafe under U.S. leadership and would begin to resist U.S. institutions and U.S. designs. That would then transition them from a U.S. ally to a revisionist power, a power that did not like the rules as they were currently written and motivated to change the rules, to change the system. And so many people referred to this post-Cold War period as the Unipolar Moment, implying that this was a temporary thing. One thing that marked the post-Cold War world was an increase in violence. This was much to the Americans' surprise, because the feeling was that at the end of the Cold War, the United States could draw down its military. Many people at the time were talking about a peace dividend, meaning the military would give back to the budget and they would be able to spend resources on other projects, or maybe lower taxes to not have the resources in the first place. That didn't happen. And one reason it didn't happen is because the bipolar competition had put a lid on simmering conflicts that the U.S.'s client states were not allowed to let ethnic conflict boil out of control. And likewise, the Soviet client states were not allowed to let that ethnic conflict boil out of control. Now, once the Cold War ended and those two powers no longer saw it in their interest to micromanage areas in the world where these ethnic conflicts were simmering for fear of a proxy war breaking out, once that restraint was removed, then many places that had these simmering disputes erupted. Another reason why many conflicts broke out was democratization. There are few places more dangerous than a newly democratic government, particularly in areas where democracy does not have a history, because in those places, parties have to appeal to something for loyalty, because there's no ideological basis for the party. It didn't exist just a few years ago. And so the parties, it was tempting for parties to draw on ethnic and religious identity as a way to garner supporters for their parties. And so in new democracies, you have ethnically based parties and religiously based parties. And as those parties compete for power, it turns from a political conflict into an ethnic conflict. And so this happened in the Balkan states. That's what's pictured here as soldiers fighting in the Balkans. It happened to a lesser degree in some African states. and it happened in some Asian states. So there was an increase in civil conflict, intra-state conflict, as a result of this New World Order. Now, many people say that the end of that period, of that post-Cold War order, is marked by the terrorist attacks on September of 2001. And those attacks form another shift in the Westphalian system. And this is a debatable notion. There are many scholars who argue that there has been no shift, that if you look at the systemic level, we are still in a U.S. unipolar hegemony, that the system has not fundamentally shifted, that the only thing that has changed is the United States is now more aggressive and more interventionist than it was prior to 2001. But the counter-argument is that the United States, because of its aggressive intervention, has shifted the dynamics of the system, that countries have had to alter their policies and altered their ways of operating because of the conflict that was brought when the hegemonic power went to war with a non-state actor of terrorists. So this is a contested notion of whether or not 2001 represents a systemic shift or not, whether or not terrorists and non-state actors count as something that could be triggering a systemic shift. So something to think about. So if we review the entire thumbnail history of the current system that has been presented in the last 3 lectures, what we find is that systemic change is infrequent. It's quite rare for the system to actually shift fundamentally or even evolutionarily make an adjustment. It doesn't happen very often. Usually when it does, the New World Order that is generated from that shift is almost always in response to a failed revisionist attempt. Some state tries to alter the existing system, usually to replace the Westphalian system with an imperial system. But when that attempt fails, then the victor rewrites the rules a little bit in order to prevent the rise of another great power revisionist state. Doesn't happen very often, but as you look at the timeline, you see that the gap between these shifts narrows, that these shifts are happening with greater frequency. And so it leads us to ask a question of whether or not we're living in another period of systemic crisis. Is our generation marked by crisis, or are we still living in a pre-existing system that probably dates back to the end of the Cold War, a period of U.S. hegemony, and that unipolar moment is still ongoing and will go on for, estimates vary, but the people who argue this argue that it will be at least 2050 before another power is strong enough to become a revisionist power. So that's the debate. It's interesting to ask the question, are we in systemic crisis? And if we are, what does the future hold?